we always think of women being more powerful in the 20th or 21st century, but actually, if you were at the French court in the 17th century, a woman, a duchess, is going to have more power than a lot of men. The ugly dwarf is kind of an image of sometimes young women would be forcibly married to very old men to make political alliances and maintain alliances.
Hello, everyone. This is Ekaterina with Trust Me Mom. And today I have a repeat guest on my show, Anne Duggan, who is a scholar and researcher of fairy tales. And we had a previous conversation where we talked about the Red Riding Hood story and Rapunzel and Sleeping Beauty, a lot of famous fairy tales that we read to our children. And today we would like to dive deeper into some of the characters and maybe even talk about the fairy tales that used to be known before and have been forgotten lately. So maybe we should resurrect some of them. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you for having me again. And this is really lovely. I always love talking about fairy tales and giving people a little twist on what the history of the fairy tales is. So thank you for having me.
Well, I'm delighted to talk to you again. And let's talk about the White Cat story. It sounds like it's been a very popular story, and somehow it is now forgotten, or only rare researchers and scholars know about this tale.
So this was an incredibly popular tale, and I can do some show and tell later. But it's an interesting tale because it's called The White Cat. So Dolnois she was familiar with Charles Perrault's tales that were coming out at the same time her tales were appearing in print. And so she kind of is drawing from Puss in Boots, which has its own. So I would say the White Cat is Puss in Boots plus Rapunzel. Okay. So the Puss in Boots, what's interesting is I mentioned in our other conversation that Giovanni Francesco Straparola and Giambattista Basile often had models of tales that French writers took and they readapted them and rewrote them. And so you kind of have that same history with cat tales. So you have Straparola wrote a tale called Constantino Fortunato, where a son, his mother dies, he has no father, and his mother leaves her son a female cat who becomes his helper, and she helps him succeed in life and marry a princess. And then Basile, who might have known Straparola's tale, did another version of this called Cagliuso, but this time it's the father. So the mother's dead, the father's dying, and he leaves his son, his youngest son, a female cat. So we have a mother giving a female cat to her son, and then a father giving a female cat to his son. And then Charles Perrault, who tends to be the most conservative writer when it comes to gender, he has a father give his son a male cat. So we see this masculinization of cat tales. So I think it's important that Dolnois decided to call it The White Cat. She's sort of playing on Puss in Boots and these earlier cat tales, and she proposes a very powerful sovereign cat. And so the tale itself is an interesting tale. It starts off a father who's a king. He has 3 sons, and he doesn't really want to give up his kingdom, but he knows he's gotten old. So he's like, okay, I'm going to send you guys on a quest, and I want you to bring me the smallest dog you can find in the world, and thinking that they'll never find anything. So the 3 sons go off, and the youngest son kind of finds his way in the woods and ends up at the castle of the White Cat. And he sees all these cats everywhere, and this beautiful white cat dressed in mourning appears, and she says, I'll help you find that dog. Hang out with me for a year. We'll have a great time. And so he has a lovely time, but then like 3 days before he has to go see his father, he's like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I don't have this dog. So she says, she gives him a little nut and says, just bring this with you. So he goes back or it's a little chest, a little container, very, very tiny. And so the son goes back to see his father, and his brothers bring dogs, and they don't think he has anything because he can put his dog in his pocket. And he pulls out this little box, and the father opens it last, and of course it's the smallest dog. But he doesn't really want to give up his throne, so he's like, okay, guys, quest number 2. I want you to find me the finest piece of cloth that can go through the head of the eye of a needle. So the youngest son goes back to the white cat. They have another wonderful year, and she's like, don't worry, I'll put my people on it. I'll get you that cloth. And so she, at the end of the year, he's like, okay, oh my God, I have to go to my dad and bring this cloth. She gives him this nut. That's where the nut comes in. And he's like, really? It's in there? And she's like, yeah, trust me. So he goes to his dad, and the other brothers bring these beautiful fine cloths, but none of them can go through the eye of a needle. And so he gives the little nut to his dad. It opens up, and there's like another smaller nut, and he opens that up, and then it's a millet seed. And then he opens up, and it's just like almost as tiny as a piece of rice that is open. And then it's this incredibly small piece of cloth that can go through the eye of a needle. But again, of course, the king doesn't really want to give up his throne. So it's like, okay, you guys have to go and bring me the most beautiful woman in the world. So the youngest son, goes back to the white cat, and she's like, don't worry, I'm on it. I'll take care of it. They hang out, have another amazing year together. And at the end of the year, the white cat's like, okay, I want you to cut off my head and my tail and throw it in the fire. And he's like, I can't do that. I love you so much. Like, he loves her so much as a cat. He doesn't really want to marry anyone else. And she's like, trust me, just cut my head off and cut my tail off and throw it in the fire. So he does. And of course, boom, there's this amazingly beautiful princess who comes out. And then she tells him her story about, and it becomes a Rapunzel story, where her mother had pregnancy cravings, and her mother was a queen, and she was married. Her king father's back home. The mother's pregnant, traveling. Her mom was a bit wild, and she started craving these fruits from a fairy garden. And she's like, I got to have those fruits. And so she sends her men to gather the fruits. They have to put these ladders up the wall to get into the fairy garden. And then the men are dying because the walls keep raising up. But finally, she makes a deal with the fairies, and the fairies say, okay, we'll give you as much fruit as you want, as long as you give us the fruit of your womb. And it's kind of funny because, like in the tale, the oldest of the fairies puts her fingers in her mouth and whistles 3 times and cries out, apricots, peaches, nectarines, cherries, plums, pears, melons, grapes, apples, oranges, lemons, currants, strawberries, raspberries, run towards my voice. And then all of a sudden, all these fruits start rolling towards the fairy, and the queen is like voraciously eating them and just like totally pigging out on these. And then she brings back like carriages full of fruit. So it's this really exaggerated and actually quite comical, because you can imagine the fairy going whoosh, and then Dolnois likes exaggeration. So the queen goes back to her husband. She has the baby, but she didn't tell the husband what happened. And then, the fairies are like, you got to give us the baby. And then the queen's like, she tells the husband the deal. He locks his wife up in a tower where she has the baby, and they won't give up the baby, but the fairies send a dragon who come, and the dragon is, destroying the land, the kingdom. So the king and queen finally realize, okay, we have to give up our daughter. So the fairies take in the daughter. She grows up in a tower, and then she's up in the tower and she sees a king, and she thinks he's very handsome. And they actually marry. He comes up into her room on her hair, just like in Rapunzel. Actually, this is related to Rapunzel tales. And then one day when the king comes up to see her and they marry secretly, the fairies have their dragon kill him, and then they turn her into a white cat. And the idea is that the white cat cannot be freed from her white cat body unless she can find and marry or fall in love with a man who looks exactly like her husband that they killed, which happens thanks to the prince. So they all go back. So she tells her story, and then they go back to see the prince's father, who's a king, and she's like, "Don't worry, keep your land. We don't need it. I have 6 kingdoms. We'll take 3, and I'll give each one of you an extra kingdom." The end. And she's really this powerful figure in the tale, which I think is really, really interesting.
Interesting indeed, because on one hand, my kind of uneducated mind in this field feels like, oh my gosh, she was doing all the work that the youngest prince was given. Why he's just reaping the rewards? So
Right.
and the reason I have that thought is because I'm familiar with a lot of Slavic fairy tales where there's a version of a frog princess, or other tales where this young heir, young prince, is given a very hard assignment.
Mm-hmm.
He finds some kind of a magic female character who does all the work for him. He just reaps the rewards, and at the end he wins, and also she will miraculously transform into a princess who'll marry him. So where is the hard work of a guy? That's the first question. But second question, it sounds like a really happy ending, nice fairy tale where everybody's happy and nobody has to suffer at the end, because she had so much wealth and 6 kingdoms that not only the older brothers in that tale don't have to fight for the kingdom, they would get one, and then she also has enough wealth to live happily ever after with this youngest prince. So can we unpack that a little bit?
Yes. So I think there are, like you said, a lot of tales like this where you have the female character, and you mentioned the Russian frog princess, which is really interesting because it's related to another tale. But I think in the case of Dolnois, she has other tales, like, for instance, she has a tale called Gracieuse et Persinée, or Gracios. I think they translate it as Graciosa and Personette. And Personette is almost like a male fairy. He has magical skills, and the princess is in that tale is persecuted, and he actually does all the work and kind of pushes her to help her free herself. So Donwa kind of plays around, and I think in her specific case, and maybe in these other cases too, it is about women being powerful. We always think of women being more powerful like in the 20th or 21st century, but actually, like, if you were at the French court in the 17th century, and this would be similar in other countries, like, we didn't have democracies, and you had kingdoms, and so a woman, a duchess, is going to have more power than a lot of men, and so you have these really powerful women who have political power, for instance, and I think Dolnois, I think she makes it very clear that her white cat isn't just a submissive helper. It's like she helps from above. She married a king. In a way, she's a queen. And she's been, I mean, one thing, so there's a couple interesting things. She's more sexually experienced. She's been married before, and he's the youngest brother of 3. He's the youngest prince, which in aristocratic families of this period, so let's take a noble family. not necessarily royalty. If you have 3 sons, the oldest son he'll inherit the father's title. So he'll become a duke. The second son he might go in the army and he might become a general, like if they're a really powerful family. And the third son will likely become a member of the clergy, depending on how wealthy the family is, because they didn't want to split up property. So they would consolidate everything in the hands of the eldest child, which is why I think is a lot of these fairy tales that were created in the early modern period, meaning the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, they favor the youngest child because legally in French and European society in general, the youngest child was not favored. If we go to what would happen with women, let's say we take the 3 women, you marry the oldest daughter. If you have enough money, you'll marry the second daughter, but you might put the third or fourth daughter in a convent and she's forced into religious life because you don't want them to have babies. Because if they reproduce, you're splitting up the inheritance, the property, and what families tended to do is consolidate it. So there's a lot of interesting things going on because here we have a female sovereign who's helping the youngest son who would have been the most disenfranchised among the 3 brothers. So he is kind of the weaker character who needs help. And I think there's other tales, and even when I think of the Russian tale about the frog princess, and there's definitely connections because in that tale you have each prince has to shoot an arrow, and that's where they're going to find their bride, and then it's the youngest who his arrow lands next to a frog, and then the frog helps him find similar things as what we see in Don Juan's The White Cat. And I'm going to throw in another tale that's similar, and it could be related to the White Cat or it could have a common source. But in the 18th century, Hannah Diab. So we think of the Arabian Nights as being one text. There was a Syrian manuscript that Antoine Gadon started translating in the early 18th century. And so he translated all of these tales from a 13th century Syrian manuscript of the Arabian Nights. When he ran out, he was like, I want more tales. And he knew this Christian Maronite, Syrian Maronite, named Hannah Diab, who told him what we call the orphan tales. And the orphan tales are oral tales that Hannah Diab related to Antoine Gadon, and then Gadon embellished them. So you could say Diab gives them the concept, the overall structure, and like a Hannah Diab tale might be 5 pages, Gadon turns it into 20, 30, or 40 pages. So Aladdin is a Hannah Diab tale, Ali Baba, and another tale. So there are many, but the most popular are those 2, and the Prince Ahmed and the Fairy Pari Banu, where at the beginning of the tale, a king says he's going to, oh yeah, there's a similar thing where 3 brothers have to go and find the most marvelous objects. And whoever gets the most marvelous object gets to marry the princess, their cousin, and all 3 brothers are in love with the cousin. And so first they gather magical, I think the oldest brother finds a magic carpet. So that's actually where the magic carpet comes from. The motif is from the fairy tale Prince Ahmed and the Fairy Pari Banu. The second brother finds a telescope, and the third brother finds an apple that will cure sickness. So there's this idea of finding 3 rare objects. In this case, the brothers realize the princess they're all in love with is sick, and they need to use all 3 rare objects to save her life. So they can't decide which object is the most valuable. So then they shoot arrows, and the one who shoots the arrow the furthest gains the hand of their cousin, the princess. And Ahmed can't find his arrow after he shoots it. So he's like, "Oh crap!" And one of the other brothers whose arrow went the furthest marries the cousin, and then he's like, "Oh, what happened?" And then he realizes his arrow went really, really, really far, and then he finds it. He finds the entrance to a cave, and he meets the fairy Peri Banu, who helps him with quests that his father demands of him. So so it's kind of interesting. It was really interesting because I was not familiar with the Russian version of the Frog Princess, but there's a total connection with the White Cat, the father with three sons, sending them on these different quests, specifically the Russian and the Prince Ahmed story. You have the shooting of the arrows. So, I was started wondering, did the Russian tale come from the Arabian Nights, which spread throughout Europe? Could it have been, it's hard to know what the influence is.
Mm-hmm.
And one of my colleagues, Ruth Bodegheimer, speculates that Dolnois and Hannah Diab might have been familiar with some similar tales, or Hannah Diab had read Dolnois' White Cat that may have influenced the Arabian Nights. And a lot of those tales also made it into oral culture. So now you're making me want to go explore the Frog Princess to see if there's an Arabian Nights, where, if that was, because a lot of times these tales were so widespread, they would feed back into oral cultures. So when you collect tales in the 19th century, it's never completely clear if they're like oral tales that circulated on their own or folklorized versions of literary tales. But yeah, there's some really, really interesting connections between all of these tales. So there's a theme that's going around in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries.
Right, and perhaps it even goes back to thousands of years ago because there are some archetypes. There are some, I think you and I briefly talked about Rumpelstiltskin before we started the recording, and you can see some elements of that story even in Greek mythology, where, for example, the thread was the thread of life, and even in Sleeping Beauty, there is that spindle. So it's a very important symbolic meaning. And think about Rapunzel, the White Cat, where they ask not for gold, not for treasures, they ask for a child.
Right.
Why are they asking for a child? And typically it's the firstborn, the most precious. Is it some kind of a sacrifice as an offering? So do you have any thoughts about that?
So there are some interesting readings about that, because a lot of so if I go back to Basile's, so if we think of Rapunzel and the Rapunzel part of Don Juan's tale, Basile wrote Petronella, where the mother is a single mother who's craving parsley, and then an ogress gives her parsley, and then she eats it and trades her baby. But the ogress doesn't take the baby until the baby turns 8 years or 7 or 8 years old. And then that actually Basile's Petronella, or Little Parsley, is a really powerful character. But parsley was it could provoke an abortion.
Yes, and I think we talked about it at our previous recording.
Yeah.
How, yes, but then why are these fairies or ogress or even Rumpelstiltskin are asking for a child?
It might be different things happening in different contexts. So so some scholars have talked about the idea that these are older women who can't reproduce anymore. So it's kind of interesting also the idea of fruit. Um like in Don Juan's tale, it's not parsley or Rapunzel, but it's literally fruit, and the fairies are old fairies, because in Don Juan's other fairy tales, you can have a young, beautiful fairy. So not all, usually the bad ones are old. So you could look at it in a couple different ways. One, um, did the mother want the child? Is the older woman taking the child away to protect the child? is the old woman childless, never had children, and this is the only way she could get a child because she can no longer bear fruit. Maybe she could never bear fruit. So there's been some interesting readings of Grimm's Rapunzel and some of the imagery that and kind of uh, in the Grimm's version of Rapunzel, sometimes it gets translated that she's a witch, but actually in the German, she's a sorceress, which is not as negative. So the Grimms take the idea that it was a fairy and turn her into a sorceress, but not a witch. And
Mhm.
and there's this idea that she cares for the child. You know, so it could be again this idea of an older woman who really, like in the case of Basile, it could be, this mother tried to abort her child. The ogre said, I'm gonna take care of her, you know. Or it could be, the old fairies, we can't bear fruit. We can grow all this fruit, but we can't grow a baby. And they have this, their garden is very lush. It's like, so I think there's these images of fertility. Um, and then I think maybe in the Grimm's version, when they rewrite the tale, there's this there's a bit of this idea of caring for, that these older female characters care about the baby. They're trying to protect the baby. They're trying to protect the baby from sex and getting pregnant before they should. you know? Sometimes they want to, in the case of Donnoise fairies, they want to arrange her marriage to an ugly dwarf, which again can be a reflection on early modern society because when the fairies kill the white cat's uh, king husband, when their dragon kills him, they give her the choice. She either has to marry an ugly dwarf or she turns into a cat. And she's just like, can't marry this ugly dwarf. But at the time, women were forced to marry men against their will. And like in Donnoise's case, she was 13 and married a man who was about 45 years old. So there was a lot of these cases. So I also think that in at least 16th, even 15th, 16th, 17th century tales, the ugly dwarf is kind of an image of the, sometimes young women would be forcibly married to very old men to make political alliances and maintain alliances. So I think like there's always that hovering in the background too, that so the fairies might have cared about her. They're behaving like actually many aristocratic parents in the 17th century. I'm going to marry you against your will to this old guy, whether you like it or not. And then the white cat's like, no. And then she gets punished by being turned into a white cat.
And was the cat considered witch? I know there's association with the witchcraft, and there was even war on cats at some point where they tried to eradicate them. Is there a meaning related to magic and witchcraft in the fairy tale?
So this might be a bit of a so I mean that can be hovering in the background, and I think women writers, I can kind of pushed back against ideas of witches, and there was this idea of cats in depending on the context, but actually in this context, and this is another piece of information I got from my colleague Ruth Bodenheimer, but it makes sense. At the French court, one of the most popular cats were white Turkish Angoras. And so white cat for people in the period might evoke not a demonic, not the witch's cat, but instead an aristocratic cat that was that accompanied. So women, aristocratic ladies would, have their beautiful white Turkish Angoras on their laps at court. So it's kind of interesting. So it always depends on, you have to look at who's writing, what is their cultural context. And so what would that reference, like if we think of a 17th century reader, I think that the white cat would be more likely to evoke the cats at court. And I also think it's interesting that in Don Juan and a lot of the 17th century tales by women, there aren't really witches, and witches become more prominent. Like the Grimms often took a bad fairy. You have good fairies and bad fairies. And I read that as there are good, powerful women at court and bad, powerful women at court. Or, you could have an aunt, your parents died, you have this evil aunt who wants to marry you to this old man you're not interested in. She's like a bad fairy. Because I think the fairies, like if we think about mythology and stuff, there's the idea of and you mentioned thread, and I was thinking of the connection between fairies and the fates.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that takes this almost very concrete form in 17th century fairy tales by women, because powerful people at court and in your family, in your aristocratic family, would make decisions that affect your fate. So a good fairy is going to try to pair the heroine and the hero with the person that is best for them. The bad fairy, the evil fairies in these fairy tales, are the ones who are trying to force men and women to marry against their will. Because there are examples as well of not necessarily, I have to think about it in Don Juan, but in other, like the first version of Beauty and the Beast by Madame de Villeneuve, which came out in like 1742, around there. It was a much more extended version of Beauty and the Beast. And the beast is turned into a beast because he rejects the advances of an ugly, powerful fairy. So that's another thing that I think is interesting, is that in a lot, especially by the fairy tale women we refer to as les conteuses, Don Juan, La Force, who wrote basically the version we know of Rapunzel that was adapted by an Austrian, or translated by an Austrian and adapted by the Grimms. Mademoiselle de l'Héritier, Madame de Murat. In all of their tales, there's really this sense of bad fairies and good fairies influencing someone's future, but it can be a male or a female character. So men are also punished for not adhering to or not submitting. Don Juan has the tale, L'Oiseau Bleu, the bluebird, where there's a king who's in love. I think he's a king who's in love with the main heroine, and he refuses to marry her ugly sister, so he's turned into a bluebird. So male and female characters can be turned into animals in the tales of this period because they refuse to submit to an arranged marriage.
That is so interesting. This is so cool to hear. And you mentioned, and it sparked my curiosity, that at certain time women at the court were more powerful than men. How so?
I mean, maybe not more powerful, but let's say that. So if you think in the like if you're a duchess, you have more power than a male count. You're higher in the hierarchy. So it's a very hierarchical society. So, a male duke might be considered more powerful than a duchess, but both of them are more powerful than a count or a marquis or a knight. So this hierarchical society based on social rank gave a certain power to women. On top of that, in the 16th and 17th century in France, you had several queens. So France was governed under what is called Salic law, which forbid women to be a queen. You couldn't have, not like in England, you had Queen Elizabeth. That couldn't happen in France because of Salic law. Nevertheless, you had in the 16th century, Catherine de Medici was queen regent, and even because her sons were too young when her husband died, when the king died, but even when her sons became kings, they were like very young. They were in their 20s. So she had a huge amount of influence. And then in the beginning of the 17th century, Marie de Medici became a queen regent. There were even power struggles between her and her son Louis XIII. And then another really powerful regent came after that, Anne of Austria, who was the mother of Louis XIV, who will be the king under whom all of these tales are written by these women authors. So you had a lot of images of powerful women. And women, so it was the ability, because women could have a higher social rank than a man, she's going to be able to have more influence. Whereas like after the French Revolution, we have this flattened hierarchy, and men have power and women don't.
Interesting. So basically, there was a period where a lot of us perceive that women are always weaker and more submissive. And in reality, a few hundred years ago, women, depending on their social status, could have had more power over men.
Yes. And even in the case like, so I'm more familiar with the aristocrats, but I have a colleague who's a professor of history, Janine Lanza, who's worked on widows in the 18th century. And so, like, let's say printers, and I'm aware of this because in so if I get a book from this 17th or 18th century, so you might have a book published by, I'll make up a name, Marchand, let's say Marchand Frères, the Marchand brothers. And then one of the brother dies, and it's like published by Marchand. And that Marchand is married, and he dies. Then his wife takes over, and then you'll see it imprinted Marchand Veuve, the widow of Marchand. And so her imprint is on the books as the publisher. So there were different domains. So the woman would have been head of a printing shop with apprentices underneath her. So there's like many different spaces where women could exercise power. I mean, of course, there were laws that men could commit adultery. If a woman committed adultery, her husband could persecute her and throw her in a convent indefinitely as sort of a prison, kind of imprison her, which happened to Madame d'Aulnoy, who wrote The White Cat. So the whole idea of being enclosed in a tower, she knew what that was.
Can you tell her story? I'm really curious how these female authors became well-known published authors. So what about the author of The White Cat? What was her story?
So she has a really interesting story. And I should also add there were a lot of, let's say the first half of the 17th century, it was harder for women to be recognized as writers. So you had women, there's one woman, Madeleine de Scudéry, who really did a lot to pave the way for women writers in the second half of the 17th century. And she wrote, she started publishing in like 1642 and published almost all the way to 1700. She lived to be some 90 years old. And the second half of the century, you already have other women authors, but there was like a boom of women authors. There were tons of women authors. Madame de Lafayette, Madame de Sévigné, Madame de Villedieu, and all these, Catherine Bernard, and many others. So there was this place for women's publishing. There was even another colleague of mine, Deborah Steinberger. She just published a book on Donneau de Vizet. And Donneau de Vizet had a journal, like a magazine, like the New Yorker, you could call it, something like that. And it was a literary journal and or magazine. And he was very popular, and he published a lot. He published fairy tales in the Mercure Galant. So some fairy tales, I think L'Héritier and Perrault, probably others, also uh, might have published one of their tales in the Mercure Galant before putting them in a collection. But he promoted women's voices. And so a lot of women contributed to his magazine in the second half of the 17th century. So D'Aulnoy herself is she's kind of in a funny, she has a very problematic history. But she she was married very young, 13 years old, to her husband, who's in his 40s, who was was maybe the lover of the Duc de Vendôme. So he was probably bisexual. He was also a gambler, and he was a drinker, a gambler, all this stuff. And D'Aulnoy had a lover, and her mother had a lover. And they're like, how do we get rid of Monsieur D'Aulnoy? How do we get rid of Madame D'Aulnoy's husband so they could have all the money? And so they tried to set him up. And at the time, if you spoke against the king, you could be imprisoned or even executed. And he would always say bad things about Louis XIV. So they tried to set it up. They tried to entrap him and have witnesses have someone provoke him to say things against Louis XIV in front of witnesses to get him prosecuted and maybe killed. But somehow their scheme was discovered, and D'Aulnoy and her mother, their lovers were both executed by the king. So she knows what repression, she knows what it means to have your lover killed. So thinking of the fairies who send the dragon, and her and her mother had to flee France. We don't know where Madame D'Aulnoy went. She wrote memoirs about England. So there's speculation she went to England. We're pretty sure she went to Spain because her mother ended up becoming a spy, ironically, a spy for Louis XIV at the Spanish court. And D'Aulnoy has it was also a very popular text, relation, was it called? A relation of relation d'un voyage en Espagne, like a relation of my trip into Spain. And then it's her traveling through Spain, talking about, she has one little fairy tale in there, and then it was a very popular text analyzing Spanish mores and culture and everything. She came back to France, and we know that thanks again to my colleague Volker Schroeder, who has a whole biography on a website called Anecdota, and he has all these archival materials on her. And so he kind of traced. So she was sent to basically locked up in a convent in Blois, in this city outside, a small city outside of Paris. And then she was allowed to come back to Paris, but was enclosed in another convent off of the Rue Mouffetard, which is a really cute street today. But she was locked up, and we know in the early 1690s, she published her first novel in 1690, which means that she was writing from confinement. She and then 1697, 1698 is when she published all her fairy tales. It's likely, she had been working on them for a while because she published 2 big volumes of fairy tales. I have them here. So she did this in 2 years, which is not an easy feat. And then finally, and it was both the king and her husband who kept her locked up. Finally, she was able to get out of the convent. And then she had her salon on the Rue Saint-Benoît, or something like that, in Paris. And then she was, I believe she was related to Madame de Murat, was friends with Laforce. So I think she knew Laforce's version of Percinet, or Little Parsley, and she parodies the scene of the mother's cravings. So they read each other's tales and are kind of, having conversations with each other through fairy tales. But I think they all had these similar experiences. La Force was exiled and confined. Murat was exiled. So all of them, when they're talking about being locked up in a tower, they were actually locked up.
Yes, very interesting.
Yeah.
And then how did they survive? Where would they get the money? I'm sure their health was in a poor condition after being imprisoned for a while. Do you have any details about their later life? How would she get the money to open a salon?
Yeah, I mean, she would have had money from the estates of her parents. So women had control over some of their inheritance, so that the dowry, there were different financial protections. And Daunois was married to her Monsieur Daunois for financial reasons, even though he dilapidated his fortune. But she still had, she would have had some inheritance to live off of. Not so she wouldn't have been. She was wealthy enough to have, some servants and things like that, but not a big. The French word comes équipage, a big, staff around her. She would have lived fairly modestly, probably, but aristocrat enough.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't know how much money they would have made off their books, but I think most of them lived off of family inheritances.
Yes. And as I'm listening to the story and the story of those female writers, it almost sounds like psychologists now recommend journaling when something really bothers you.
Yes.
You write about it, and here it's the ultimate journal of their lives, as well as some of the happy endings where they didn't have it in real life, but they offloaded some of the struggles in a
Yeah.
metaphor, but also were able to complete the story the way they want.
I totally agree. I totally think that is definitely part of what's happening is, yeah, I get my happy ending. I get to marry the guy I want. Yeah.
And we can give advice to parents since I have a parenting channel. If you really struggle in life, write it out and make your own story. At least it can lead to another fantastic novel or fairy tale that can take off.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can imagine your life through these fictions and give yourself a happy ending. And one thing I wanted to show, just do because Donwa was so popular, and I'm gonna talk about so her White Cat was adapted to the stage, and this is one of those, what do you call those? Now I forgot the name of the machine, but where you can see this in 3D.
Oh, it's like a little slide you
Yeah,
inserted in the machine. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
and these are of a play based on her fairy tale, and it was a fairy musical so these were sold for people to, so they would have gone to see the White Cat in the theater as a musical. And then this is 19th century. And another thing that I thought was so awesome is that in the 19th century, so this is from, it's called Chocolat Poulain, it's Poulain Chocolate, a chocolate company. And what they did is they would put one of these in a chocolate bar. And so here's part one of La Chatte, of the White Cat, that has the first part of the story. And if you can see, they're all, oh, this is no part two. I don't know where part one is. And so they serialize. And so you'd have to buy all the chocolate bars to get all the images and the full story of the White Cat.
Early marketing. I see that. Similar to
Yeah.
baseball cards or yeah.
It's like that of her fairy tale. And there were so many books, so I'll just share a few. So still in 1935, this was a version in French of the White Cat that was published in Paris, London, Edinburgh, and Toronto. This is a 1926 edition of her tales, illustrated by actually a fairly famous Spanish writer and illustrator, Lola Anglada. And so this is like, let's see. Oh yeah, like here we have a cool image of the old fairies with the fruit garden as the backstory. But and I'll show you, this is also a French comic book version from 1935 of the White Cat. So you can see it has like it's like a comic book of the whole story. And strangely enough, there's also a Mexican version from 1965 of the White Cat that was published. Like here is when he cuts off her. She becomes a beautiful Lana Turner, I guess.
Yeah.
So there was, but one thing that I thought was really cool is that she was also published in English in the United States and England, and this is one of the really a beautifully illustrated version of the White Cat by Elizabeth McKinstry. She was an American poet, illustrator, sculptor, so she was an artist. And there's I'm trying to find like one of the color images because they're really, I'll just show you. Here's one of the black and white images. Just some really, so this is specifically, oh, that's a different story, but that's Gracioso. So here's the White Cat. Here's the White Cat. So that was published in New York. There was also, I think, in New York, 1943, a comic book version of the White Cat in the United States. So who would think? 1972 London. I kind of like because there's a scene where they go hunting and the White Cat rides on a monkey.
Yes, in one story, I thought that the White Cat had a monkey and a dog.
Yeah. I can't remember the dog, but the monkey, yeah, she goes riding on the monkey when they go hunting. That's her.
Yes, that's right. It's in the second visit when the young prince came back to her, the second year, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, here's the funny, and this is from London, 1978.
Oh, the prince looks like a very young boy.
A little boy, yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because the poudre chocolat, like they make, it's intended for younger boys. So like the prince, so you can see also how they shape the tale to suit audiences. So this is like more for younger boys. So the prince looks younger, more like a child, whereas the Mexican book is more geared towards like maybe teenagers or even young adults. So the characters are older. Like this French one is probably geared more towards children. So you can see how the images. I love looking at the images to see how they're shaped to communicate the tale to different audiences. So there were some this is targeting children, this is targeting this group. So it's kind of interesting to look at that history too of illustration and reshaping the tale. But one thing I thought was awesome is in all of these, they keep the powerful female character. She's always powerful. So they didn't dumb down kind of the strong female character in these different versions.
Well, that sounds very interesting. And it sounds like this is a fairy tale that modern parents can start reading to their children. I'm sure a lot of us are tired of the same stories over and over again.
Yeah.
And it's nice to find something from the history that is empowering, that is timeless, that has very interesting storyline. So I would love to read that story to my daughter later today.
Yes, absolutely. And just a side note, I have some colleagues who are because her original tales tend to be very long, and they're putting together a book with images. I'll definitely let you know when it comes out, of tales by Dolnois and these other women fairy tale writers, and they kind of condense them. So kind of are doing a modern version with an artist who's doing all the images.
Oh, yes, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, but they're definitely. I actually got my my niece when she was maybe 10 a whole collection of Donwa's fairy tales in English for her.
That's so good. I bought the old Italian fairy tales, and this is not appropriate for young child, it sounds like. So it's good to know that the white cat story will be a good one. Safe
Yeah.
story to tell. Yeah.
And I think there might be some little hints that adults might get, but the children won't. So.
Oh, that was such a pleasure. I always like to meet with you, unpack the stories behind famous fairy tales. It was so enlightening again. Thank you so much.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Happy to talk about Dolnois and fairy tales anytime.